Before then we start, I should not only thank Alex for being here, but also introduce him to all of you. You may know that Alex is a consulting actuary, that he established his own firm, Marcuson Consultants Limited, back in 2010. Before that, he'd worked with Deloitte, both here and in Australia, and also with Bacon and Woodrow. He's advised, he tells me, across a wide range of general insurance and reinsurers, domestic and international, and across a wide range of classes of business, and particular focus being around reserving, capital modelling, and the expert witness rules. So far as the Institute is concerned, Alex has also led the Professional Standards Committee for the General Insurance Board from 2008 until 2013, and he's been a very active participant in the development of APS X1 and X2, and is currently a member of the GI Board Reserve Oversight Committee, and clearly therefore somebody very, very capable and appropriate for our discussions this evening. So, final point to stress is that you should have collected copies of the case studies. You might also find useful copies of the guides, the overall guidance to APX2, which Emma's going to speak about in a minute, and then a particular guidance pamphlet around the transition arrangements in relation to APS P2 and its revocation from 1st July, and the introduction of APS X2, and if you will, some transitional points for consideration. And there are also copies, I think, of the Actuaries Code. I'm sure you know that probably by heart. And I think within the case studies, you'll also have received a copy, I think, in hard form of the APS X2 standard itself. So on that basis, Emma.
So welcome everybody. Tonight, as Des said, I'm going to spend maybe the next 15 or 20 minutes just taking you through the new requirements, hopefully just to warm you all up for a bit of discussion and a look at a case study. So what we're talking about today is the IFoA's new cross-practice standard on the review of actuarial work. And this is essentially a new mandatory standard known as APS X2, which relates to work review and independent peer review. And those are two phrases that I'll come to look at in a bit more detail and to explain. And we've been describing this as a bit of a first, as we think that we're probably the first actuarial professional body to introduce a specific cross-practice standard on review of work, although others are working on their own versions, so we're quite proud of this new standard that we've introduced. And in terms of background to the new standard, it is part of a range of measures that we're introducing in relation to the processes and procedures that assure the quality of actuarial work produced by our members. The other such measure is the introduction of a quality assurance scheme, which is an accreditation scheme for organisations, which we're planning to launch later this year, and which will involve a specific requirement for accredited organisations to have and to be following policies and procedures in relation to review of work. So this APS is part of that whole piece of work that we're doing in relation to assuring the quality of work. And in terms of the current position, we don't currently have any cross-practice requirements in relation to review. There are specific requirements in relation to compliance review for pension scheme actuaries, which I think maybe two people in this room put their hand up to knowing about, and that's in a standard known as APS P2, which will be withdrawn at the same time as this new standard is introduced. But there is nothing currently for any of the other practice areas, and in doing these sessions to different types of audiences, I think some of the scheme actuaries have been a bit surprised by that. They often think that there's an equivalent standard for other practice areas, but APS X2 will change the situation, and it will introduce requirements for all members regardless of the practice area in which they're involved. And I think this new standard does reflect a shift by the IFoA towards having more cross-practice standards for its members where that's possible. The idea being that anyone who is a member is meeting broadly the same ethical professional standards. And what it also does is it attempts to bring the IFoA standards in line with international actuarial standards, and in particular those produced by the International Actuarial Association. It has, as some of you may know, a general model standard known as ISAP 1, which includes a requirement in relation to review. So APS X2 is also an attempt to try and bring the IFoA standards in line with that as well. So again, in the same way as we at the IFoA are moving towards applying the same standards across members regardless of practice area, so this is an attempt by the international actuarial community to try and have consistency internationally. So with that background, just turning to the standard itself, and if I click another button, you will see exactly what it looks like. So it's known as APS X2 Review of Actuarial Work, and you can see just on the right-hand side up on your slide what it looks like, and hopefully you also picked up a copy of it when you were coming in. And you'll see from that I mean, it's really quite short, it's quite brief. I mean, it's really only a few A4 pages, which for those of you that are familiar with our other standards is kind of a bit of a departure. They tend to be quite a lot longer, so it is a little bit different in terms of its style. It is quite a brief document. And this is a new approach to review of work, in that firstly, it involves a mandatory requirement, so that's a new thing. And secondly, it's principles-based, and it relies upon the professional judgment of members. So it doesn't set out a list of situations in which you must apply review. It doesn't specify precisely what form that review will take. What it does is it places a requirement upon members to determine what is the most appropriate and proportionate way to deal with the particular situation. And I think an important point to note about the APS is that it applies to all of our members. So that really includes members in all categories. It means students are covered by it. If you're a partially regulated member, then you're also covered by it. Essentially, if you're responsible for a piece of actuarial work, then you need to now think about APS X2. It's also not limited by geographic scope. So it applies to members wherever they're located and wherever the work is being carried out. And that makes it quite unusual in terms of IFoA standards, which have tended in the past either to restrict the full requirements to UK work or which relate to roles created by UK legislation, but not so in this case. It has no geographic restrictions. Very important point, it will come into force on the 1st of July 2015, so in just over 3 weeks' time. And what we have done is we have, as Des mentioned, produced guidance which is supposed to try and help you understand the requirements, sets out some kind of practical help with that, so quite a useful document, and please do take one away if you haven't already picked one up. So just turning to the requirements themselves, I've put up on the slide sort of the 3 key requirements under APS X2. And you'll see from this that what we're introducing is firstly a requirement to consider whether a work review process should be applied to actuarial work for which a member is responsible. We're introducing a presumption that where a work review process is deemed appropriate and proportionate, it should be applied. And we're introducing a requirement to consider, in particular, whether that work review should take the form of independent peer review. And there are some kind of concepts and phrases which we introduce here, which I've highlighted in red, which are quite key to these requirements and which I thought it might be worth spending a bit more time just looking at. So this APS applies to actuarial work for which a member is responsible. And I put up there the definition, and it's worth just reading that out, I think. It is work undertaken by a member in their capacity as a person with actuarial skills on which the intended recipient of that work is entitled to rely. This may include carrying out calculations, modelling, the rendering of advice, recommendations, findings, or opinions. And I think it's fair to say that it's pretty broad. It's likely to capture a wide range of activities that a member might be involved in that aren't just traditional types of kind of reports produced in an actuarial office. It could include unpaid work. It could include work carried out in non-traditional roles. It could include academic work and so on. So it's a very broad definition that we have in this APS, and intentionally so. But the point to remember is that whilst this might mean that the APS is quite broad in its scope and that it will apply to a lot of different pieces of work, this does not necessarily always equate to a review process being applied in all of those situations. What APS X2 isn't saying is that review will be required in every situation where a person is responsible for actuarial work. It is saying that there is a requirement to consider review that will be triggered. And then, if that consideration leads to a conclusion that review is required, then there is this presumption that it should be applied. We also have this concept of work review included in the APS. And again, this is quite key to the standard too. And this is defined as consideration of work by another individual or individuals. And I think some of you may be wondering why we've used this term work review. I think we used the term peer review in one of the earlier versions that was consulted upon. I think one of the things that became quite clear from our consultation on the new standard was that the term peer review, which we'd used in the earlier version of it, had different meanings to different people. So what we've tried to do is to use a phrase that will not cause confusion. So we've gone with work review instead of peer review. And this is intended to be a very broad concept for the purposes of APS X2. So in terms of this definition, it can encompass a whole spectrum of different types of review. And that can be anything from simple checking of numbers by a colleague to a full independent peer review process and anything that sits around any of those things. So it's this very broad spectrum that we've introduced. And then we also have this other concept which we introduced in APS X2, which is independent peer review. And for the purposes of APS X2, this is essentially a subset or a category or a form of work review with some quite specific criteria. And the specific criteria are, firstly, that the review is carried out by someone not otherwise involved in the work in question, so the independence part of it. And secondly, that the person would have had the experience and expertise to have taken responsibility for the work themselves, so the peer requirement as well. And what APS X2 requires is that members consider whether a work review process should be applied. So you've got an obligation to consider. So essentially what we're saying is that members have to apply their minds to the issue and use their professional judgment. Now, that isn't the same as discretion as to whether or not to apply a review. The requirement is kind of tested on an objective basis. So it's really about what the reasonable actuary in those circumstances would do. So that's the kind of mindset that you have to put yourself into when you're applying your mind in terms of APS X2. And there are a number of factors specified in the APS, and you'll see that set out, that are likely to be relevant to that decision. So things like, for example, the degree of difficulty and complexity of the piece of work, the potential significant consequences of the work, and so on. So it's worth having a look at those factors to see the sort of things that might point you in one direction or the other, either in terms of whether to apply a work review process or about the form that it should take. And there is also this specific requirement to consider independent peer review. So members must specifically apply their minds to whether that is appropriate and proportionate. And I think it's fair to say that that is more likely to be appropriate in situations where the consequences are more significant and where the work is particularly complex or where there's a large degree of judgment required. So they're the sort of things that might point you in the direction of an independent peer review process. Although, again, that is left to the member to decide using their own professional judgment. So it's about applying your mind. And if, in a particular situation, a member does conclude that a review process is appropriate and proportionate, be that a work review process, be that an independent peer review process, then the APS provides that they should apply it. So that means that there is a presumption that you will apply it, but also recognises that there may be circumstances where it's possible to justify non-compliance. So just to touch briefly upon some of the other requirements around APS X2, which are more about the way that it might be applied. Firstly, only a hot review will be sufficient to meet the requirements of APS X2. So by that I mean that it has to be carried out at a time where it is capable of influencing the outcome of the piece of advice or work. So essentially it has to be reviewed at a time where it can still make a difference to whatever the output is. Secondly, there are particular requirements imposed upon the person responsible for the work in terms of the roles of those involved in the review process. So, for example, there's a requirement in relation to ensuring that those involved in carrying out a review understand their role and have appropriate experience and expertise, and that sort of thing. And there's another requirement on the person responsible for the work to take steps to ensure that the person is able to carry it out with objectivity. So the person responsible has these other kind of specific requirements about the person that's carrying out the review or the people that are carrying out the review. And thirdly, and this is actually quite important, there is a requirement for members to be in a position to justify the approach they have taken to the application or not of review if they're asked to do so. Now, the APS is not prescriptive about how members meet that requirement. There is no specific requirement for any form of recording. However, I think it's likely that good practice and the safest course of action will be to record in some form certain decisions made in relation to review. So, for example, where there's no review process applied to a piece of work, which is really quite significant, or where the decision is made not to apply independent peer review when it might potentially have been expected, those might be situations where it might be sensible to keep some sort of record, because you may be asked to justify it and you're under the specific requirement now to be able to justify it if asked. And actually the guide is quite helpful in that regard and provides a bit more assistance on understanding how that requirement might be met. And then just to kind of finish off, I know there's not very many people who deal with EPS P2 just now, but just to kind of put in this final piece of the picture of this new world of review, there is going to be the withdrawal of the existing EPS P2, which currently imposes requirements for review on scheme actuaries carrying out particular types of reserved work. And that will be withdrawn at the same time as EPS X2 is introduced. So on the 1st of July, there is going to be the switch over for everybody into the new EPS X2 system. And what we have produced, I think, as Des pointed out earlier, is this a document which is supposed to help people with the transition from P2 to X2. So that's, again, if you are operating under EPS P2, have a look at that and hopefully provide some helpful practical guidance. And I have put up here just some kind of key things about the withdrawal of EPS P2. I won't go into it in a lot of detail given the audience, but essentially one of the key things that it's a switch from a rules-based to a principles-based system. So as some of you may know, EPS P2 is very prescriptive and based on a list of different situations where review should be applied with specific rules around what that review involves. It's kind of got different situations where you have to apply review, etc. EPS X2 takes a more principles-based approach and attempts to empower members to exercise professional judgment in relation to the review applied. So that has a number of consequences. There is a bit more flexibility around that because there is now this ability to exercise judgment. But on the flip side, there is now this introduction of the specific requirement to think about independent peer review, where that wasn't necessarily something that was required under APS P2. APS P2 also permitted code review, which obviously, given what I've just said about hot review being a requirement in terms of APS X2, isn't suitable for the purposes of complying with APS X2. So there's a few changes. Again, the guidance is quite helpful for anybody that's having to deal with that transition, so have a little look at that. So just to sum up, the main points probably to take away from this section before I hand over to Alex to think a bit more about the practicalities is that for any actuarial work for which you're responsible, and bear in mind that really broad definition of actuarial work that we have for this standard, you need to think about whether a work review process is appropriate and proportionate. And you need to think in particular about whether a full independent peer review process should be applied. You're now also required to be able to justify decisions about the process is applied or not to work. So if it's a difficult decision, if you think there's something that there's a chance that review might have been expected and you haven't applied it, then it's going to be quite sensible to try and keep some sort of record and audit trail so that you can show how you reached that decision. So they're all things just to think about. And on that note, I think I'll hand over to Alex.
Let's pause there. And whilst we get the microphone up and ready, has there anyone got any questions that they want to put now? Right. If you give us a second, we'll get the microphone. See? He said looking for it. There it is at the back. If you just put your hands up again, right, just near the middle aisle there, at the back, then we'll come to the front.
Oh, hi, I'm Anthony Pepper. I think this is all very well, but there have been cases of people that are not actuaries have misused actuarial principles. It seems to me they should be included in this as well. But if someone who's not an actuary has said something that's obviously completely wrong, there should be some sort of action that can be taken against them, some way of disciplining.
Well, it seems to me that APS X2 clearly only relates to members of IFoA. It's worth noting that the FRC's recent consultation on possible changes to TAS 100, I think, posits the proposition that TAS 100 would apply to anyone applying undertaking actuarial work, whether or not he or she is an actuary. It also probably is the case, it seems to me, that if an individual were to misrepresent themselves and mislead the recipient of their advice, to whom they were, let's say, charging a fee, that might create civil penalties. But I'm not aware that there is any civil sanction that exists under FRC or the IFoA itself about, as it were, someone posing as an actuary when they're not an actuary. I think I'm right in saying that, aren't I? So I'm not sure we can necessarily go much further unless any of my colleagues on the panel want to add anything to that. Nope. I do understand your point, but as I say, I think as things stand at the moment, there is no mechanism that I can readily think of that would address the mischief that you've just laid out. Shall we move to the next questioner? There's one here at the front.
John Instance, the FRC. I'd like to say we welcome very much APSX2, and I'm sure it will contribute greatly to the quality of actuarial work. The question I have is, how do the profession intend to monitor its application?
Right, I suspect I probably should have a go at that. Well, I think we're looking to consider how we monitor this in a number of ways. The first point is worth stressing, and I know you'll be familiar with this, the work that we're doing around our quality assurance scheme, and we'll shortly be publicising our decision to go ahead with such a scheme, albeit it's worth stressing that that is focused on the employers of actuaries. But we see that as part of the process. We're currently working with FRC and other colleagues to consider how we're going to monitor the effectiveness of this rule change. And we've got a number of propositions and ideas, largely, I think, based around the work that we've done hitherto to do with the practicing regime. And I know that has limitations and restrictions to who it captures. But we're also thinking about certain other steps that we might do in terms of some form of sensible sampling that would give us some indications and so on and so forth. And this is likely, I think, to be a subject that we return to and either we consult with or certainly share ideas with the profession before we go much further. So I think the point, however, that I suspect you are also referring to, and it's worth sharing with a wider audience, is that we do need, I think, to be seen, not only to, as it were, prescribe a rule, albeit a principle-based rule, but we need also to be seen to making sure that it is effective and is being applied. And so that is something we're going to have to come up with some answers on. Anyone else? We'll take this gentleman here, and then we'll go to the right at the back.
John Spain, speaking personally. Actually, my question is provoked by what you just said, and that is trying to monitor what's happening. If you go back quite a long time, it used to be considered that the Institute and the Faculty of Actuaries, separate bodies of course, were really very good because there were almost no cases of professional misconduct being discovered. In fact, that was probably not the case. And I just wonder whether or not you're actually looking for scalps over the next several years just to show that the next system will work or not.
Let me deal with that very quickly. I'm reminded of Robert Peel. And I take by that reference the fact that we police, if that's the right word, by assent. And that we're all policemen. We're all part of the process. My guess is that all of you care deeply about the profession that you are part of and that you want to see that profession operating sensibly in the public interest and in a proportionate and fair manner. And if we've got people who are not following the rules, then people are concerned about that. What we, from a regulation point of view, need to be very conscious of is, as I say, we do, using my expression, police with consent, and we need to have the confidence of the vast majority of reasonable, fair-minded actuaries. And if we were going around looking for some sacrificial lambs or some scalps to parade through the centre of the town on the back of a cart before they appear at the guillotine, we would very quickly, I think, be rumbled, and people would lose confidence, and we would lose that policing by assent. So that's something that's very clear in our mind. I think it is the basis on which, if you will, collegiately all professions operate. And so that there has to be that overriding confidence in the process. What we're interested in is not catching people out, it's not ambushing people, but helping people to comply with the standards expected of them. And that's about drafting things that are proportionate and effective, and monitoring goes to effectiveness, and it's about applying them consistently and in a transparent and open fashion that commands general confidence and support. Should we go to, at the back, I think on this side, if my memory serves me right, and then I see a question on the other side as well. I think it was on this side, if I remember rightly.
Hi, Lindsay Edwards from the Pension Protection Fund. I kind of have two questions. It's around the definition of actuarial work and also the link into TAS 100. So working in pensions but not in a scheme actuarial context, could you give a bit more guidance on what you think would actually constitute actuarial work? For example, would it be some knowledge of the general pensions landscape, or is it only if you're basically doing maths?
Emma, why don't you have a go at answering this question before we come on to the question of TAS 100 and its definition?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that we have gone for a very intentionally broad definition of actuarial work. So, I mean, when you look at it, I mean, it's work undertaken by a member in their capacity as a person with actuarial skills on which the recipient is entitled to rely. So you really have to ask questions about, are you taking this work in the capacity as somebody that has actuarial skills? The person that you're doing that work for, do they have an expectation because you're an actuary, that kind of thing? I think what I would say is that thinking about the obligation itself and that it is something to consider whether a work review process is appropriate and proportionate and that kind of thing, that is this consideration thing. I think that erring on the side of caution in terms of it falling into actuarial work is probably the kind of appropriate way to address it. So if you think that you fall within it, you probably do, would be my steer.
Okay, thanks.
Can I just add to that? You obviously have the definition in clause 3 of the standard. As I say, that's being consciously drafted in the way you see it there. We are trying to avoid being too prescriptive because it is very, very difficult if you have a particularly prescriptive rule to anticipate every twist and turn and change of way in which circumstances apply. Equally, we also recognise that we need to be fair and reasonable, back to our last questioner, in terms of giving people as much clarity as we can. And it's really quite difficult to go much beyond the words that we've got there. If you're uncertain or unsure, then the support services that the profession through the IFoA provides, so the guidance, the advice lines and so on and so forth, are available. And that will be there to help you. I think by and large, albeit that there will be some fact or case sensitivity, if you're following the points in there, and if you look at, for example, the criteria listed in clause 1.3, you're going to be well placed, I think, to identify and define what is actuarial work. I think you had a second point as well, if I remember rightly.
Yes, it was around how APS X2 ties in with TAS 100, given that the definitions of actuarial work are slightly different in the two standards.
Yes, it's something that we are very conscious of. Emma also, I think, referred to the fact that we're also conscious that international bodies, who I think are going to be increasingly relevant to the practice of everyone, also have or are in the process of providing definitions. We very much recognise that avoiding confusion, or as it were, two competitive regimes with different definitions is to be avoided. We're working with colleagues at the FRC to see if we can make some progress to clarify those matters. TAS 100 is, as it were, at the consultation or draft stage. I think there's time for us to see what can be done, and we're trying to remove confusions and competing definitions if that's possible. But I repeat, we do have to have an eye to the fact that the FRC has, as you will, a jurisdiction-bound obligations to practice largely here in the UK. For the Institute and many, many of its members, the international dimension and definitions from international bodies have to be taken into account as well.
Thank you.
I think there was a question on this side.
Hi. Currently, scheme actuary does a piece of work. Typically, he asks another scheme actuary to peer review it. Will there be a change in that sort of expectation or rule in that sort of under the new scenario? Could it be done by someone who's got pensions actuary, but necessarily a scheme actuary?
I mean, obviously we now switched to a kind of principles-based system, so as you'll know, EPS P2 is quite prescriptive about who would carry out certain forms of review. What we now say is that you've got to kind of consider what is appropriate and proportionate. So really it's about whether you think it's appropriate and proportionate on an objectively tested basis to have another scheme actually carry out that piece of work. I mean, what I would say, and I think we've said that in our guidance on transition, which should be worth a look for a bit more detail, is that we don't expect there to be a significant amount of difference in terms of the amount of review or the type of review that's being carried out. But there is a different approach, so it's a different way of looking at it. So it's really now about you exercising your professional judgment to determine whether that's appropriate and proportionate.
Any more questions at this point? Right, let's move on and ask Alex to speak to us now. He's going to look at some of the practical aspects of what we've been discussing so far. We'll then have another opportunity for questions to Alex before we go to the case studies.
Thank you, Des. Good evening, everyone. I fear some of the questions may have been asked already, or the things I was going to say, but in a different context. But really what struck me with the guidance, I just wanted to sort of share with you a few thoughts I had for a few minutes about the challenges that I see there are and the kind of questions that I hear fellow members, certainly in the GI community, but I'm sure GI actuaries aren't alone with having the same reservations. But really, the one that kind of seems to be the nub of it is, how do I make it, this is not proportionate regulation. It's all very well for people on these sort of working parties to sit in their ivory towers and think about some great standards. And isn't it wonderful, the idea of setting up some rules in place, let's call them principles-based, but fundamentally they're still rules, and push comes to shove, you still got to do them, and you have to follow your checklist, and if you don't do them, you're going to get in trouble, and if you do, you're fine. And this real challenge of how do you actually make this something proportionate. And so I think the important thing, and the way I approach is actually step back and think, well, what are we really trying to get at here? And fundamentally, it's about getting your work checked. The whole spectrum of things. The number of times that over my career I've seen pieces of work that have gone out that, frankly, if they had another pair of eyes cast over them, some of these errors wouldn't have been made. And so at one extreme, there actually are some pretty basic, simple things, and all the profession is articulating is, actually, we think it's a really good idea. If you're going to do a piece of work as an actuary, then you should get that checked. Equally, the idea of peer review, we make some pretty big, substantial judgments in our careers. And some of these really do matter, and they're not easy. And just having a disciplined reminder there, call it the devil on your shoulder or whatever, that actually just reminds you that if it is a big, important call, you do need to make sure you've got a framework in place before you actually are up there late at night trying to finalize the numbers, that you do have a responsibility to get someone else to look at this with a cold towel and make sure you're not going to make a fool of yourself. No one is going to remember the actuary who paused and said, actually, I want to have someone else look at this piece of work. Might cause a bit of trouble and anger with the recipient if there's a challenge. But if this is about actually pausing for a moment and asking someone else to look at a really big call, then you won't get remembered for doing that. You will get remembered for being the person who did something ludicrous and it got dragged through the courts and your personal reputation dragged through the mud. So that is the kind of the big thing about it. Let's look at this and what we are actually trying to achieve with this standard. The other important thing I think it is important to stress, and part of the reason why the wording is crafted in if I say an artfully or deliberately vague fashion, is you shouldn't view peer review as an opportunity to just let the ball go through to the keeper and not to worry about it. And equally, time and again, you do see instances where people are kind of like, well, someone else will pick up on this. So making sure that the onus is on you as the actuary to be responsible for the work, and the peer review is actually a bit about keeping you honest. I think the short answer to this question is yes. I'm just not sure that's a particularly helpful one. What I actually think, in a practical fashion, to get on top of the standard, is you need to think about what is the framework, what is the risk framework that's going on here. And it doesn't really matter, and it shouldn't really matter whether you are an employed actuary, a consultant, a jobbing contractor, or one of the very many hybrid variations of modes of employment that actuaries have these days. But thinking about what is the risk framework that your end user has. So if they know they're getting you in just to kind of knock a quick spreadsheet together, the context of that is entirely different from where they've asked you to stand up and do an extended piece of work with a large team, and you're the figurehead of this team, and they are buying your brand to give them confidence that it's right, because they know that the results, the profits they declare, fundamentally rely on that. So it is important. What is the risk framework of the firm? Without trying to sort of sound all Solvency II-ish about this, do think about, what are the contexts of this? What is the risk if it goes wrong? And when we look at our case study, we'll play around a little bit with the kind of these ideas of what's material and what's important. Comes back to the point that one of the questioners asked earlier. And as I said before, there are two answers to this. There's the risk to the user of your advice. And the point is that quite often, certainly in the general insurance field, pricing actuaries say, this isn't fair. All I'm doing is performing some calculations that are routinely applied, and you're saying that every single time I do this, I have to apply this actuarial standard, or I have to get the work peer reviewed. So the important thing is actually, what was it one of my former bosses said, a lot of this is about doing the practice work, putting the armour on, taking the armour off, putting it on, taking it off, do the drill, get used to it. So it's second nature. And then think about what your risk framework is, which are the things that matter, where is it actually tolerable that a mistake might be made and it's not the end of the world. So thinking about that and thinking through what the consequence of that is will help you then to say which are the really big judgments and which aren't. If someone is a junior actuary or a junior student who's being asked to perform a mechanical calculation with a model that's been checked and checked and checked, then the extent of checking and review work that's required is entirely different from some other pieces of work that you might ask more senior actuaries in your team to apply. As all good actuaries, we like self-referential problems. So what if you're doing a piece of audit work? Or what if you're doing a piece of validation work? What if you're the peer reviewer? Do you need to get a peer review for your own work? And maybe that peer review should get a peer reviewer. The point is, again, think about the risk and the context of the work that you're doing. Are you making big judgments here? Is this the kind of judgment where you need to have a peer review? And which are the bits that actually you should be getting another pair of eyes to look at, and another sounding board to provide that independent peer review to the work you're doing? No more, no less. That was my 4 practical tips.
Well, before we go to the case study, let me just check. Are there any points anyone would like to make, or questions, or comments in terms of those points that Alex has just made? Yes, let me get the microphone to you, sir.
Does the profession think that this is actually going to lead to quite a bit more work, or just a little bit more work, or what? Because I know you're leaving the onus on the practitioners to decide when reviews should take place. And you could then get employers turning around and saying, do we really want all this extra effort going in, extra expense, extra time? Is it really adding anything?
Alex, you were talking about taking your armour on and off. Here you go.
I think, the question is really about what is it you're asking to check. I think it could be quite challenging to have the conversation with the employers if you go back and say, I want every cell in every spreadsheet to be checked and every decision checked to the nth degree, and actually what you're proposing is a massive scaling up of the work that you're doing. If actually what you're saying is, yes, as an actuary, of course this is normal practice, that the important stuff that I do is looked at by another pair of eyes, and the big judgments, we think about the risk process, because actually those people you're talking to are themselves going to have risk frameworks, and I'm not aware of that many FDs who are prepared to just chuck out any old balance sheet, profit loss numbers. By and large, quite a lot of them really do care that they produce a sensible number. So there isn't a good simple answer there, but there is a basis for actually quite a challenging and important conversation for the firm that you work for.
Could I just add as well, I mean, I do understand the concerns that you're alluding to in your question, and the question about putting it back on the actuary to make this decision. Unsurprisingly, I would tend to disagree with that particular point, and I think that what's worth stressing is that the adoption of a principle-based or outcome-focused approach, and in particular the words of Clause 1, are designed to, in setting the standard, equip you with the means by which you're only being required to act in a proportionate fashion. So back to that earlier question, I'm doing, forgive my expression, a bog standard piece of calculation in relation to my role as a scheme actuary. You may well take the view that on something that is comparatively contemporary, hasn't changed, has been reviewed quite recently, where there are no case-sensitive factors that would say a different approach is required, that you might reasonably conclude in those circumstances that the appropriate and proportionate response is that work review might not be required then. There may be different views that would say on a piece of advice that you were giving to trustees about a more judgmental-based approach, that the conclusions then not only required work review but also independent peer review. So the idea behind the way this is framed is to try and give people flexibility within the way in which the rule and policy is structured to act in a manner that is proportionate and is appropriate. And I think that is to be preferred to an absolute rule, thou shalt do this, which I think is a much more likely set of scenario in which we're going to add cost and burden to both the profession and users of the profession's services. We may be continuing afterwards on that. Here we go at the front.
Thank you, Craig Martindale. I just wondered if you've given any thought or whether you've got any ambition or expectation that the new standard will be applied consistently between different members and how we might go forward as a profession to kind of achieve that, because it seems to be one of the great downsides of principles-based regulation is, that different individuals can go about it however they wish. And I'm kind of drawing an analogy with a large principles-based piece of regulation that many of us will have been involved with over the past 10 years, the insurance sector, and I think we've seen plenty of examples there of how different people can go down different routes and lead to different outcomes. So that's question one. The second question is, have we looked at what other professions do? So, for example, do chartered accountants have a similar, you talked about sort of signing off balance sheets, do they have kind of similar requirements? Now, just it's good to make sure that we're not sort of looking very different to our colleagues in other similar allied professions.
Emma?
I mean, in terms of the first thing, obviously it's principles-based. Of its nature, people are going to interpret it differently. And because it's about circumstances, particular circumstances, it's quite difficult to kind of see. I mean, what we are planning to do is to try and gather kind of, where people have put queries to the professional support service, or where we've had kind of FAQs and things like that. We are going to hopefully be able to produce some material like that. Again, part of the monitoring will be about understanding how it's being applied and that kind of thing, so maybe we can draw a little bit from that. I mean, in terms of other ways and other approaches, I mean, we have looked at different kind of ways in which different professions have dealt with it. I think ours is a wee bit different to most. Others may have a different view. So we think it's the right thing for us. I don't know if anybody's got anything else to add on that.
I'd be surprised if there's any degree of uniformity and homogeneity across the profession. Just as before this exists, some firms choose to make a big play of their extent of peer review, some firms' internal practices, if you look at what they do with underwriting standards, and some take underwriting peer review extremely seriously and very thoroughly, and some firms are much more big picture in terms of the way they structure their teams. Same with claims handling. I don't think what we're saying is actually anything particularly radical. We're putting a bit of a baseline in there, but I think there's quite a lot of scope for firms to differentiate and judge how they think the best way to run their businesses. When we got first involved with this, I remember having lunch with a chap who's a surgeon, and I was kind of moaning about the fact that we'd been asked to kind of write a standard for brushing our teeth. Sorry, it's peer review. What amazed me was he said, well, yeah, kind of when we do an operation, we kind of write down a list of these are the risk factors and this is what we're going to do, and then we get another surgeon to make sure that what we're doing is sensible. And actually, if you think about it, someone's going to put you to sleep and cut you open. I think you might be quite glad to think that actually is happening. So I don't think what we are talking about necessarily is anything completely off the wall. And I think it is helpful just to think about, rather than think about kind of what it is for our day-to-day work, think about if we were to get some legal advice or some medical advice, under what circumstances would we or wouldn't we feel like we ought to have peer review of the work that we're doing?
So I think you were going to ask a question as well.
I'm worried about the extent to which the outcomes in practice are going to be taken into account in deciding whether or not something was okay in the first place. In a GI environment, with which I'm totally unfamiliar, I can imagine one actuary saying, I'm going to go for distribution A for this particular set of risks. And the peer reviewing actuary, the independent peer reviewer or the other reviewer says, you can't possibly use that, you've got to use something else. And the first actuary is going to say, no, I'm going to go with this, and we're going to write it down that you said you thought it was wrong, but I'm going to go with it anyway, and we'll see what the board say. Now, if it's right or wrong, I'd like to know how you see that sort of thing. I'm thinking of, for example, in a life area, already alluded to, equitable life, where the impact was heavy for different reasons.
Well, I wonder whether work review, and particularly in the context of your question, independent peer review, is about the reviewer substituting his or her conclusion for the author of the work in the first place. I don't know what the rest of you think, but I don't think that's what work review, peer review is. It seems to me that you would be looking at methodology, the assumptions, the applicability of the techniques or approaches that have been adopted, and the reasonableness in the context of the conclusions. Now, if the conclusions or judgments, answers, whatever you want to call it, were egregious, so were ridiculously wide of what would be a reasonable set of expected range of answers, judgments, views, then I suspect the reviewer would have to speak out. So I would suggest, with respect, that the proposition in your question is somewhat twisted. Why don't we, forgive me if I'm going to interrupt you there, because I did say we'd try and ensure that we covered all components of our presentation within the hour. I'm going to move to the case study. We can, as I say, if people have time to stay on, we can do that. Alex, can I turn to you? I'm going to go with, first of all, the GI case study.
Right, let's get straight to it. What I'm going to suggest is we've got about 10 rows. So if you're on the sort of first 5 rows, chap in the blue shirt, front of the lady in the orange on that side. If you're the lady in the orange, if you people behind you do 2 on that side, then you do question 1. And I'll come and ask people on this side to do question 3, and question 4. You probably will want to read through the whole thing because they do all interact. But I'll give you a couple of minutes just to actually spend a bit of time, read it through, and just sort of, if you can cluster in 2s and 3s around yourself about the questions, and hopefully you'll see sort of some of the points we've been talking about. I'm going to dive in and interrupt. I appreciate it's not giving many people much chance to have much discussion, but I think if we don't start, then we really won't have a chance of getting done by past. Let's go for question 1. We've got a scenario where we've got a junior actuary, a head of pricing, P, and our overall head of the actuarial function, chief actuary. 2 scenarios, one where we're looking at a very small, titchy little transaction, not material for the business, and something which actually could swing the profits of the year. So, question 1, what are the obligations on each of our 3 protagonists in respect of work review and peer review? Anyone from our Group 1 heroes over here?
Well, for a very subset of this group, I mean, on the first one, we'd be surprised even if H&P were involved. It's immaterial. It depends, I don't know where. I assume they would have some authority limits, and if Jay's got that authority limit, then you might think, oh, this is small, do I need to get it with, I'm using established pricing, it's a technical price, I'm hopefully not tweaking too much. Then we come on to the second one. Clearly it's material. I'd assume actually it'd be below Jay's pricing authority anyway, so it's probably going up to P. Then the question is, with P, are they reviewing their own work? I mean, so P may want to think about, because it's a material piece of work, taking it along to the chief actuary to get some sort of independent peer review.
Yep. So pretty sensible points. I mean, it's any other points people had in the group? No? Okay, well, I think we should push on because some of the other bits will sort of bounce around there. What about the task of what additional obligations might we find that there should be? What are the other things that we might need to touch? Anyone in sort of Group 2 thinking about the kind of bits that don't necessarily have to do, but it might be worth considering need to be covered in the context of this scenario? Anyone back there?
I think we need a volunteer, or you're going to have to pick on some hapless individual.
It's always tough, isn't it? I mean, these are the people who've chosen to sit at the back of the room. I know there's a pricing actuary there. Wait a sec, just wait for the microphone.
Sorry. Yes, as a head of pricing, certainly in scenario 2, I'd consider talking to my capital modelling colleagues and assessing the capital impact on the syndicate as well, the managing agent, to the extent that the pricing model may have limitations and not do that. Managing agent London market pricing models aren't as sophisticated as personal lines, so there will be known limitations. You may want to day-to-day, that may be a known limitation for the smaller risks, but for a large 5%, you may want the head of pricing / chief actuary ought to consider those limitations and consider whether they need reviewing in the context of this contract.
And I think it all sort of depends on the boundaries about what you have to do and where you consider the additional obligations are. And I think the whole point about materiality and actually where it fits into the general risk framework. Right, question 3, motoring through this. A few scenarios where we sort of change things around a little bit. One is H doesn't actually independently peer review the pricing model updates. So the pricing model is there but hasn't been peer reviewed. What might you do differently in that situation? And then these 2 other cases about you being an actuary. the underwriter who's asked for the piece of work, what could change there, and also H&P, if they're not actuaries. Increasingly these days, there's discussion about the fact that some head of actuarial functions might not be actuaries, and how does that affect the roles, P in particular, if their boss isn't an actuary? Does that make a difference to the situation or the way you act? Any people in Group 3 have strong views on this?
We're going to have to sit here all night until someone volunteers an answer.
Go on, David. At the front. Thank you.
I think it's irrelevant to what profession, if any, you is a member of, because you has just said to Jay, please do this work. Mm. So I don't think that's kind of relevant at all. I mean, there is clear onus on Jay and APSX2 to get his or her work checked. I guess if H or P are not actuaries, then the standard doesn't apply to them. If P is an actuary, then P is doing the work of actually running this pricing model, so that work needs to be checked as well.
Mm. Yeah. So just throwing it open, if H or P aren't actuaries, could either of them act as a suitable peer reviewer given this scenario? And under what circumstances might they be appropriate to be peer reviewers? Any circumstances at all? Anyone think that there could be circumstances where they might be an appropriate peer reviewer? No one? I mean, H is head of actuarial function. I mean, sure, they must have some skills. Or is this just kind of, it's 6:30 and everyone was. Sorry? Actually, just wait for the microphone, sorry. Yeah.
I was just making the broad point that I don't see what their qualifications have to do with the role that they fulfill. So in my view, whether H or P are actuaries doesn't change the scenario at all.
So could J, or indeed, if could J say, well, although P isn't an actuary, they're head of pricing, and I'm comfortable they've got enough technical skills that they can, in this particular situation, act as peer reviewer?
Only to the extent that it's not an independent review, obviously, because both P and H were involved in the development of the pricing models. Mm. But I think it's wrong to assume that just because they're not qualified actuaries that the work that they've done would have been completed to any lower standard than if they were.
Oh, precisely. I mean, that was sort of the point I was getting at, that it seems to me that if these people are fulfilling a particular role and you have the confidence that they have a particular set of skills and experience, that notwithstanding the fact they don't have the professional qualification, you might come to a conclusion that they might be appropriate peer reviewers for a piece of work that, of this nature. It's not always going to be the case, and I don't think they're hard and fast rules. But I don't think that the way the standard is drafted precludes you from coming to a legitimate conclusion like that. David, it's just a point in front.
Quickly add, where I work, we have CAP modelling specialists who are not members of our profession, but I would happily ask them to review work I've done because it's their field of expertise, so they're ably qualified to review it, and asking them will clearly meet the standards of considering and having my work checked.
Actually, I'm going to assist the chap a few rows behind because he hasn't had a chance to speak.
Thank you. I was just going to challenge slightly a comment before that if you, the underwriter, is an actuary and your junior actuary producing work for him, isn't there some kind of potential expectation that they may also be checking, reviewing the work that you pass to them? So it might depend on the relationship between the two parties as to whether the junior actuary might want to get some kind of external peer review, or your H&Ps and so on to do extra work.
My take, I mean, clearly you don't have enough facts to know the whole situation and what's, all the ins and outs. But I could appreciate situations when it might be appropriate for Jay to feel like they've done a piece of work and you can act as some form of reviewer. Clearly you may or may not conclude that they're independent or not. Equally, there may be situations when you, even if they are an actuary, you shouldn't expect that they are going to peer review just because they're the recipient. So, again, it comes back to this having those intelligent conversations about whose role what is, and I think there is a little piece in the standard that talks about understanding who's going to do what in there. What about moving on to 4? People at the back. Anyone have any views? Oh, actually, why don't we get everyone to answer the question? Who thinks that your answer would change if Jay is a contractor? Hands up. And who thinks it wouldn't? Okay, that's good. Even got some of the 3s, great. What about if you are a consultant? If Jay is a consultant doing some pricing work, do you think the response should change? Which response for that? And those of you who don't think the response should change, just because Jay is a consultant. And there was one who thought the response should. Come back, because clearly you're thinking of a particular scenario.
No, I think if someone is a consultant, then there's a possibility that there is some sort of work review of the work he does as a consultant. Whereas in the other cases, it would be someone I think because Jay is for junior. So, and in the other 2 cases, I think it would just be a junior on his own, whereas in a consultancy situation, he may well have some sort of review because he is external.
Yeah. No, I think the point's well made that it may well be that part of the risk framework of the firm is actually we're getting the consultancy to provide the quality assurance for this piece of work. Equally, that may not be appropriate. I'll skip through the middle one. I'm conscious of points on time and just sort of throw it back for questions. Thank you.
Right. Any more questions? As I say, we're flexible on time. If people have got things they want to raise with us, then that's fine. Anybody got anything else they want to, any comments or thoughts, and not only just questions? So, yes, we'll get the microphone to you right at the front here.
Thank you. This one particularly bothers me because not coming from a GI environment, I'm not completely clear what even all the technical jargon means. But what really worries me is you have an area of work where many, many non-actuaries for many, many years have been working quite well without actuaries involved. Actuaries have become more involved over recent years, which may be a good or bad thing, not for me to comment on that. But just because an actuary is carrying out that work doesn't make it necessarily actuarial. And I think there is a bit of a problem area here in that just because the actuary is doing it, suddenly somebody is labelling it actuarial because they have these skills upon which somebody else can rely, that this is exposing people to a higher degree of inspection than would be the case for somebody else. It just doesn't seem right.
No, and I think that's perfectly fair, and I think firms will take their own decisions as to what they think is the right way to draw the boundaries as to what they do and don't want in the context of their own businesses.
Questioner there, while we get the microphone to you, I think, though, I would add to that the definition doesn't mean that simply because the work is being done by an actuary makes that work actuarial work. So if I were, let's say, I don't know, I'm promoted on behalf of this underwriting agency to be in charge of marketing, and I'm a qualified actuary, and I'm doing marketing work, just because I'm an actuary doesn't turn that marketing work into actuarial work for the purposes of this rule.
And conversely, if I'm being employed to do sums, because actuaries are good at sums, and we tell people that we're good at sums and they like us to do the sums because we do them well and get them checked, then I think it's entirely appropriate that we are held to a greater standard, because that's exactly what the standard that we are selling.
Thoughts on that point? People agree or disagree? If prepared to express a view. Certainly, yes, sorry, in the middle there.
Just to take the case of you as an actuary being a marketing manager and somebody else is not an actuary being a marketing manager, it seems to me there's a very considerable difference because as an actuary, you're then under the actuarial code, whereas if you're not an actuary, you're not under that code. And this seems to me to lead to all sorts of anomalies.
Such as?
Well, if you did something that was considered unreasonable, somebody could hold you up with disciplinary procedures. But if you weren't an actuary, they wouldn't be able to do that. They can only do it to actuaries.
Well, I think that must be right, and I realise a simple set of facts. That must be right, but it seems to me it goes to the point of our last commentator that if you say there is a value, a kudos, a status to being an actuary that sets an actuary apart from someone who isn't an actuary, depending on the type of work they're doing, that you would expect those sorts of standards that you're referring to apply. It seems to me that an example you've quoted, however, that wouldn't necessarily make that marketing work actuarial work for the purposes of APS X2. Right in the back there.
Whilst I can agree that the marketing work might be an extreme example, I've actually been employed as an underwriting director. When am I an underwriter and when am I an actuary, given that underwriting is risk assessment, pricing and exposure management? I think when I'm actually employed as an underwriter, it's an interesting question I wouldn't actually know how to answer.
Yes, I think it is an interesting question because, again, as you remember, part of the definition we have in the standard, it talks about the likelihood, the reasonableness, acceptability of people relying on what you're doing as an actor, as a member of the institute, as being a factor in terms of whether it's actuarial work. So I'm a non-executive director. Was I hired because I was an actuary to sit on the board of that life insurance company, say? So I do agree with you that there are going to be shades of grey in all of this, and that isn't easy. But it is, I suggest to you, difficult to see a better way of trying to resolve this than having a principle-based approach and the definitions and the approaches that the system lays out, the policy standard lays out here. I'm conscious that time has moved on. We've gone beyond our allotted time. If there are further questions that people want to raise, we're going to turn the cameras off. The three of us are going to be around for a little while. We're very happy to do that. Other than that, can I just simply say three things? First of all, if you have time before you leave, can you please fill in the feedback forms? It's very helpful for the IFoA in designing these events. Secondly, thank you for being here. Copies of the slides and all the other material is going on the website. And thirdly, perhaps you join me in thanking in the usual fashion our two speakers.